The man who built the world's fastest growing economy no one talks about. There is a country that has grown faster than China did in its prime. Faster than South Korea during its miracle years. Faster than any economy the IMF has tracked in the last 2 decades. And you have probably never once thought about it. Not because the story is hidden. The data is public. The numbers are real. It is because the man who built it does not particularly want your attention. He wants your investment. There is a difference. His name is Paul Kagame. And what he has done in Rwanda is either the most remarkable economic transformation of the 21st century, or the most sophisticated illusion of one. Possibly both. Let us start with what actually happened. In 1994, Rwanda ceased to exist as a functioning state. That is not an exaggeration. In 100 days, roughly 800,000 people were killed. The infrastructure collapsed. The institutions collapsed. A third of the population fled or was dead. What remained was a country with no economy, no government worth speaking of, no foreign reserves, and no obvious reason to believe it would survive as a nation at all. Most countries that experience that level of destruction take generations to recover. Some never do. Rwanda took about 15 years to become one of the fastest growing economies on the continent. By 2000, Kagame was running the country. By 2010, GDP per capita had more than doubled. By 2019, Rwanda was growing at roughly 8% a year. Foreign direct investment was climbing. Corruption rankings, which are notoriously hard to fake at scale, placed Rwanda ahead of Italy, Greece, and most of its African peers. The World Bank called it a model. The IMF called it impressive. Business leaders flew in from London and Singapore and New York to see what was happening. What was happening, exactly? Here is the part that gets interesting. Kagame did something that most leaders are terrified to do. He decided that Rwanda could not compete on natural resources, because it does not have many. It could not compete on cheap labor alone, because other countries have more. It could not compete on size, because with 14 million people, it is one of the most densely populated but smallest economies on the continent. So he decided to compete on something almost no poor country has ever successfully competed on from scratch. Trust. Specifically, the perception of institutional trust. The idea that if you bring your money here, the rules will be followed. Contracts will be honored. Officials will not shake you down at the airport. Your factory will not be seized because some general's cousin wants it. That sounds obvious. Every government claims it. The difference is that Kagame actually enforced it. Rwanda became obsessively clean. Literally. Plastic bags were banned in 2008, years before most of Europe got around to debating it. Kigali, the capital, is regularly ranked the cleanest city in Africa. Every last Saturday of the month, citizens are required to come outside and clean their neighborhoods. It is called umuganda. It is compulsory. That detail matters, and we will come back to it. The cleanliness is real, but it is also a signal. It says, this place is controlled. Things here work the way they are supposed to. And investors respond to signals. Now here is where the math starts to get uncomfortable. Rwanda growth numbers are extraordinary. Nobody serious disputes that. But growth from what baseline? When your economy is essentially destroyed, doubling it is not as impressive as the percentage suggests. A country growing at 8% from a very low base is still, in absolute terms, a very small economy. Rwanda GDP today is roughly $14 billion. That is less than the annual revenue of a mid-sized American retailer. So the miracle is real, but the scale needs context. The more complicated question is how it is funded. Rwanda spends heavily on public infrastructure, health, and education. That is good, but roughly 30 to 40% of its national budget, depending on the year, comes from foreign aid. That is an enormous number. It means that a significant portion of what looks like state capacity is actually subsidized by external donors, many of whom have strategic or political reasons to keep Rwanda stable and presentable. The country is, in a sense, partially underwritten by the international community's desire for a success story in a region with very few of them. Kagame understood this dynamic perfectly. He packaged Rwanda as a product and sold it to exactly the right audience. The product is elegant, honestly. You have to give him credit. He positioned Rwanda as the Singapore of Africa. The reference point is deliberate. Singapore under Lee Kuan Yew was also an authoritarian technocracy that delivered spectacular growth. also had restrictions on press freedom, also prioritized stability over plurality, and also became, for a generation, the go-to example of what discipline and governance could achieve. Kagame studied that playbook and adapted it. He hired Western consultants, Western PR firms, and Western economists to help design and communicate the vision. Rwanda became the preferred conference destination for global health summits, tech investment forums, and development economics gatherings. The message was always the same: come see what is possible when government actually works. And for the visitors who came, it largely checked out. The roads are good, the hospitals function, the schools have roofs, the officials show up. But here is the irony. The same discipline that makes Rwanda function also makes it impossible to fully audit. Press freedom in Rwanda ranks near the bottom globally. Opposition politicians have a habit of ending up in prison or in exile or, in a small number of documented cases, dead. The 2017 election, in which Kagame won with 98.6% of the vote, was described by international observers as taking place in a climate of fear. 98.6%. Even North Korea usually leaves a little room for doubt. So what do you do with that? This is the part of the story where most people want a clean answer. Either Kagame is a visionary who made brutal trade-offs in service of genuine progress, or he is a sophisticated authoritarian who wrapped repression in the language of development economics. The frustrating reality is that the evidence supports both simultaneously. Child mortality in Rwanda has dropped by 70% since 2000. That is not a number you can fake with PR. Real children are alive who would otherwise be dead. Life expectancy has nearly doubled since the genocide. Universal health insurance, called Mutuelle de Santé, covers over 90% of the population. That is a higher coverage rate than the United States. These are not imaginary achievements. But the political opposition is also not imaginary. The journalists who disappear are not imaginary. The Rwandan military's documented activities in the neighboring Democratic Republic of Congo. Activities that have contributed to one of the worst ongoing humanitarian crises on the planet, are also not imaginary. The economy is growing. The region around Rwanda is burning. And Kagame sits at the center of both facts. Zoom out further and the picture gets stranger still. Rwanda has positioned itself as a hub for the new African economy. It is headquarters to the African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat. It has become a destination for technology investment and cryptocurrency experimentation. Kigali is building a convention center district that looks like it was designed by someone who had a dream about Dubai. And Western governments and institutions continue to fund and praise and photograph themselves alongside Kagame. Because the alternative, acknowledging that the model has deep structural problems, would require them to question 30 years of development theory that Rwanda was supposed to validate. The incentive to keep calling it a miracle is enormous. For donors, for development banks, for the consultants and economists who built careers advising the Rwandan government. For Kagame himself, what happens to the story if the money slows down? What happens if aid dependency, which has barely moved in 2 decades of growth, turns out to be structural rather than transitional? What happens when the man who holds the entire system together by sheer force of will and political control is no longer there? Singapore eventually democratized. Slowly, partially, but it moved. Rwanda has not. And Kagame, who is now in his mid-60s, changed the constitution in 2015 to allow himself to potentially remain in power until 2034. Here is the thought I keep returning to. Rwanda is a country of 14 million people that has accomplished things the rest of the world could not ignore. The numbers are real. The progress is real. The suffering that preceded it was also real, and the suffering that continues in its shadow is real. The question is not whether Paul Kagame built something. He clearly did. The question is what he built it on, and whether something built on that foundation can outlast the man who laid it. Every miracle economy in history has eventually had to answer that question. Rwanda has not answered it yet.